cameras were rolling. The audience was settling into what promised to be an uplifting segment about education and childhood literacy. Margaret Walsh sat in the guest chair with the quiet dignity of someone who had dedicated her life to children, her well-worn cardigan and practical shoes telling the story of 28 years spent in elementary school classrooms. But in the next 15 minutes, everything would change. David Letterman would ask one simple question about teaching, and Margaret would reveal a story so heartbreaking, so fundamentally wrong, that it would silence 300 people and force a nation to confront the reality that in America, being a hero can cost you everything. It was Thursday evening, October 15th, 2024. Inside the Ed Sullivan Theater, the familiar rhythm of late-night television created a sense of comfort that would soon be shattered by a story that challenged everything the audience thought they knew about education and poverty. Margaret looked exactly like what you'd expect from a beloved third-grade teacher, 52 years old with kind eyes behind reading glasses, graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a navy cardigan that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. Her hands showed the telltale signs of someone who spent her days with children. Ink stains under her nails, a small Band-Aid on her finger. She was there to discuss the Lincoln Elementary Reading Revolution, a literacy program she'd developed that had dramatically improved test scores in one of Detroit's most challenging schools. It was exactly the kind of segment David loved. Dedicated teachers making a difference against impossible odds, proving that education could transform lives even in the most difficult circumstances. "So, Margaret, tell us about this reading program you've created," David said, settling into his chair with genuine interest. "The statistics are pretty incredible. Test scores up 30% in just 2 years. What's your secret?" Margaret's voice carried the patient cadence of someone who had explained complex concepts to 8-year-olds for nearly 3 decades. "Well, David, the secret isn't really revolutionary at all. It's just meeting children where they are, understanding what they need, and creating an environment where learning feels safe and possible." The audience murmured appreciatively. This was familiar territory. The universal respect for teachers who went above and beyond. "And what does that look like in practice?" David asked. "How do you create that environment?" "You start by understanding that children can't learn when they're hungry," Margaret said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone. "And they can't focus when they don't know where they're sleeping tonight." David's eyebrows rose slightly. There was something in Margaret's voice that suggested this wasn't just educational theory. This was personal experience drawn from real encounters with children facing real hardships. "That sounds like you're speaking from specific experience," David said gently. Margaret was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she looked back up at David, her professional composure was beginning to crack, revealing something raw and painful underneath. 2 years ago, I started noticing things about some of my students," she said quietly. "Jalen would fall asleep at his desk every afternoon, but not because he was bored or lazy. He was exhausted because he'd spent the night in the back seat of his mother's car in a Walmart parking lot." The studio had grown attentive. Something in Margaret's tone suggested this conversation was about to go somewhere unexpected, somewhere that would challenge the comfortable assumptions that allowed audiences to feel good about the state of education in America. Emma would hoard her lunch, stuffing crackers and fruit cups into her backpack when she thought no one was looking. "I thought she was just being wasteful until I realized she was saving food because she wasn't sure when she'd eat again." And Marcus would come to school in the same clothes 3 days in a row, not because his family didn't care about his appearance, but because they were living out of garbage bags in their car and had nowhere to do laundry. David felt his stomach tighten. "Margaret, are you telling me that your students were homeless?" "7 of them," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. 7 children in my class of 22 were living in cars with their families. Not because their parents were drug addicts or criminals or irresponsible, because even working full-time at minimum wage in Detroit, you can't afford rent on an apartment. The audience was completely silent now. This wasn't a heartwarming story about educational innovation. This was a devastating revelation about child poverty in America, about the hidden crisis that existed in schools across the country. These were good families, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her students with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had become their advocate. Jalen's mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and stocking shelves during the day. She'd sleep in the car for 2 hours between shifts, then wake up to drive Jalen to school. Emma's father was a security guard who picked up construction work on weekends, sometimes going 72 hours without sleep to make ends meet. Marcus's parents both worked at a fast food restaurant, splitting shifts so someone could always watch the kids. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a folder of photographs, handling them with the care of someone preserving precious memories. "These are my students," she said, showing David pictures of children grinning at school events, raising their hands in class, proudly displaying artwork. "Look at their faces. They're not victims. They're children who deserve the same chances as every other child." David was looking at the photos, but he could see that Margaret's hands were trembling as she held them, each image representing not just a student, but a complex family situation she had tried desperately to help. "So what did you do?" he asked softly. "At first I did what I was supposed to do," Margaret said, her voice taking on the frustration of someone who had tried to work within a system that wasn't designed to handle the reality she was facing. "I reported the situations to the school administration, contacted social services, followed all the proper protocols. Do you know what happened?" David shook his head, though he suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. "Nothing," Margaret said flatly. "Social services was overwhelmed and underfunded. The housing waiting list was 18 months long. The school administration said it wasn't our job to solve housing problems, just to educate children. But how do you educate a child who's so hungry they can't concentrate? How do you teach reading to a kid who's falling asleep because they spent the night sitting up in a car?" Margaret's professional composure was completely gone now. She was talking with the passion of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for too long, someone who had seen the gap between educational theory and the brutal reality of childhood poverty. "So I started doing what I could," she said. "When the temperature dropped below freezing, I paid for hotel rooms, just for a night or two so the families could get warm, shower, sleep in actual beds. When I saw Emma hiding food, I started bringing extra snacks and putting them quietly in her backpack. When Marcus came to school in dirty clothes, I kept spare outfits in my classroom and found excuses to send him to help me with something so he could change." David was struggling to process what he was hearing. "Margaret, you were using your own money to help these families?" "My teacher's salary isn't much," Margaret said with a bitter laugh, "but it was more than these families had. I started buying groceries and delivering them to whatever parking lot the families were staying in that week. I learned which Walmart allowed overnight parking, which gas stations had clean bathrooms, which McDonald's would let kids do homework without hassling them about buying food." The audience was openly crying now. Several people in the front row had their hands over their mouths in shock, struggling to process the reality that in their own communities, children were living in cars while their teacher spent her own salary trying to keep them alive. "But that wasn't enough," Margaret continued. "In November, when it started getting really cold, I realized these children were going to freeze, so I rented a small apartment." David's eyes widened. "You rented an apartment?" "A 1-bedroom place about 10 minutes from school," Margaret said. "Nothing fancy, but it had heat and running water and a roof that didn't leak. I told the landlord that relatives were visiting from out of state and needed a place to stay temporarily. Then I let the families use it in rotation." Margaret pulled out a notebook from her purse, its pages filled with careful handwriting in different colored pens. "I kept a schedule," she said. "The Johnsons would stay Monday and Tuesday, the Garcias Wednesday and Thursday, the Williams family on weekends. Everyone got 2 nights a week in a real bed, with a kitchen where they could cook actual meals and a bathroom where they could maintain dignity." David was speechless. This wasn't just going above and beyond. This was a teacher using her entire salary to house her students' families, creating an informal shelter system out of her own pocket. "For 6 months it worked," Margaret said, her voice taking on a note of something that might have been happiness. "Test scores started improving because kids could sleep. Behavior problems disappeared because children weren't hungry. Emma stopped hoarding food. Jalen started participating in class discussions. Marcus began turning in homework assignments written on clean paper instead of napkins. David could see where the story was going, and he dreaded asking the next question. What happened? Margaret's face crumpled. A parent complained. What do you mean a parent complained? Not one of the families I was helping, Margaret said quickly. Another parent. A woman whose child was in my class but who lived in a house with 2 cars and took family vacations to Disney World. She found out about what I was doing and filed a complaint with the school board. David felt sick. What did she complain about? She said I was making other parents look bad, Margaret said, tears starting to flow. She said it was inappropriate for a teacher to be so involved in students' personal lives. She said it created an unfair advantage for some children and made parents who couldn't afford to help feel guilty. Margaret wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. The school board launched an investigation. They said I had violated professional boundaries, created liability issues, and engaged in financial irregularities by using school resources to coordinate housing arrangements. David was struggling to maintain his composure. What was their decision? Last week they fired me, Margaret said simply. After 28 years of teaching, after watching hundreds of children learn to read, after improving test scores and graduation rates, they fired me for caring too much. The studio fell into the kind of silence that follows a revelation so fundamentally wrong that it challenges everything you thought you knew about justice and fairness. Margaret, David said, his voice thick with emotion, what about your pension, your benefits, your future? Gone, Margaret said, because I was terminated for cause I lose my pension. 28 years of paying into the system, and I get nothing. I'm 52 years old with no savings because I spent everything on hotel rooms and grocery bills and rent for families who needed help. David stood up from his desk and walked over to Margaret's chair. Without asking permission, he knelt down beside her. What about the children? He asked gently. What happened to your students? They've been scattered, Margaret said, sobbing now. Reassigned to other schools, other teachers who don't know their stories. Jalen's family moved to a different district. Emma's father found work in another city. Marcus and his family are back to living in their car because they can't afford the apartment without my help. Margaret looked directly into the camera, her face streaked with tears, but her voice strong with conviction. These weren't charity cases, she said. These were my students, children who deserved the same opportunities as every other child in America. Children whose only crime was being born to parents who work full-time but still can't afford housing in a country that claims to value family and education. Behind the scenes, David made a decision that would define this moment forever. He looked directly into the camera, abandoning any pretense of entertainment. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. What you've just heard represents everything that's wrong with our priorities as a society. We live in a country where a teacher gets fired for preventing children from freezing, where caring too much is a firing offense, where following your conscience costs you your career. He turned back to Margaret. But here's what I want you to know. You didn't fail those children. The system failed them, and the system failed you. David reached into his jacket and pulled out his personal checkbook. Margaret, what was your annual salary? Margaret looked confused. $42,000? And how much did you spend helping these families? About $30,000 last year, Margaret whispered. David began writing a check. Then here's what's going to happen. You're getting your pension, all of it, calculated for 28 years of service, and you're getting a salary for next year, and the year after that, and for as long as you want to keep teaching children. He tore the check out of his checkbook and handed it to Margaret. $1 million, use it to start your own school, hire teachers who understand that education isn't just about test scores, and never let anyone tell you that caring too much is a character flaw. Margaret stared at the check like it was written in a foreign language. David, I can't accept this. You're not accepting charity, David said firmly. You're accepting justice. Because a teacher who spends her own salary to house homeless children doesn't deserve to be fired. She deserves to be celebrated. The audience erupted in applause, but David wasn't finished. He looked back at the camera. If you're watching this at home and you're wondering how this is possible in America, look around your own community, look at your own schools. Ask yourself, how many Margaret Walshes are out there right now spending their own money to feed hungry children, using their own resources to help families in crisis, and getting fired for it? He paused, looking back at Margaret, who was still staring at the check through her tears. Because the real tragedy isn't that we have teachers like Margaret. It's that we punish them for being exactly what we claim to want. People who care more about children than bureaucracy, who choose compassion over policy, who understand that education isn't just about what happens in the classroom. As the show ended and the credits rolled, Margaret sat in the guest chair, still holding David's check. The piece of paper represented more than money. It represented validation that her choices had been right, that caring for children was never wrong, and that sometimes, when institutions fail, individuals have to step forward to do what's right. The 7 families she had helped were still scattered, still struggling, still in need. But Margaret Walsh would teach again, and this time she'd have the resources to build something better. A place where caring too much wasn't a firing offense, but the whole point.